Hey guys, today we have Ammon Bartram, co-founder of SocialCam, TripleByte, and he is here to talk to us about hiring. So could you just give us a quick intro about what you've worked on?
Cool. So I joined Justin TV fresh out of school in 2009 when it was just 25 folks, and kind of went through the roller coaster of the early days of Justin TV. And there I worked mostly on the video system. And I think that was where I got my first sort of taste of hiring. You know, we were, at the end of that, we were hiring pretty aggressively. And that was when I first realized how much noise there is in the hiring process, let's say.
Okay, yes.
And then I was part of the spin-off of SocialCam, and that was a sort of video sharing app. Mm-hmm. I did that for about 3.5 years. And we were acquired by Autodesk in 2012. And I worked there until 2014, and then took a bit of time off and started TripleByte.
Cool. And so TripleByte, just for context for people, can you explain?
Sure. So we're a recruiting startup. So we help startups hire engineers.
Okay.
And so engineers apply to us, and then we do sort of a full interview with them, pass the engineers who are good and match them with companies where they have a high probability of doing well.
Cool. So people ask us a million questions about hiring, recruiting, all of it. In general, let's assume that you're, an early stage startup. What should companies be looking for in an engineer?
There's not a crisp answer to that. I think the pithiest answer I can give to that is you have to decide what it is you want to look for, and then you have to effectively look for that. Okay. So sort of the status quo, actually, I think there's some sort of an important truth here. Mm-hmm. Most companies think that they are trying to hire good engineers. That's what they say to themselves. And what they don't realize is that, company A's definition of a good engineer is significantly different from company B's. Mm-hmm. And so what you have is a situation where everyone has this definition in mind, and they're all different. And this is a big source of noise. Mm-hmm. So for example, if one, company thinks that engineers need to be, very fast and productive and be able to show that in an interview, and a different company thinks that engineers need to be, very intellectual and be able to deeply understand computer science topics and talk crisply about that. Mm-hmm. What happens is sort of all of the awesomely productive, engineers, very practical, not necessarily as strong academics who apply to the second company fail. And all of the very academic could totally solve all your hard problems, but maybe aren't quite as flashy in a web environment. Engineers who apply to the first company also fail. And so it's, for companies that are a bit of a larger stage, I think the obvious answer is you want to hire both those people. Mm-hmm. And so it's about building a process that can identify more broadly different types of skill. For smaller companies, I think you're more in a situation where you may well actually only want one of those folks. You may well, the thing that's holding your company back may well be productivity. And we need someone who's going to come in and be productive and sort of bang out code. And if that's the case, you need to realize that it's not important that everyone you hire be strong in computer science. And if you are, a company where you're facing security issues and, really clean code, really precise code, and solving hard problems is important to you, then, at an early stage, and it probably makes sense to have a process that skews more in that direction.
And so do you have general advice for people that come to you guys at TripleByte, or just you as a friend advisor, for diagnosing what kind of engineer is a good engineer for your company? What do you tell people?
We don't. So it's funny. We're rarely in that situation, actually. I think most people have strong preconceptions. So we're more often in the situation of sort of broadening people's vision of what a skilled engineer can be. Mm-hmm. But I think the obvious. Yeah, let me circle back to the question. What happens a lot. This is a mistake that's easy to fall into. Is when people are interviewing an engineer, mm-hmm. they tend to ask about the things that they are the best at. There's this overlap between the things that you're the best at and the things that you think are the most important. So every engineer thinks the things that they know are kind of the core of the discipline. And so you ask everyone who you interview those questions, you bias yourself toward hiring engineers who have those skills. They join your team. They ask people they interview the same type of question. And so the whole organization can grow in a direction that might not make sense.
Okay.
It's very complicated because there are plenty of examples of companies with defined engineering cultures that have worked out very well. So, for example, Google, has intentionally or unintentionally grown very much in a computer science direction, and that's obviously worked out, very well for them.
Yeah.
There are other companies in YC I just don't want to say names,
sure.
But there are companies that take a sort of the complete opposite, take a very human, productivity friendly approach, and are also extremely successful, excellent companies. And so, answering that question is not. Basically, there are success cases on both sides. But I think when you're hiring your first employers, I think you need to just basically try to decide what's holding us back.
And so say I'm trying to vet this pool of engineers and they all fit the certain rubric that I've created, right?
Yep.
But maybe one of them did a boot camp and has some projects, and then one of them, went to a great school, has a CS degree. So how should I think about, credentials and experience?
Boot camps versus CS degree, I don't think are all that different. Now, okay, that's obviously a kind of a forceful statement. So I think experience matters more than where you got your education, right? So someone fresh out of a CS program who doesn't have internships is still essentially a junior engineer. And perhaps they may have a more academic slant to what they've studied than someone out of a boot camp. But both those people lack real-world experience. I think categorizing that differently than someone who has worked in the industry for 5 years and can own projects, right? The skill that you can most easily measure in an interview is ability to think through relatively small problems quickly. That's really what interviews can evaluate.
Okay.
The skill that you need in an employee is quite different. The ability to solve large, sprawling problems well, but over a long period of time. And there's obviously a correlation there. It's not. We use interviews as a proxy of evaluating actual skill because there is a correlation there. But the correlation is not perfect. And an interesting observation is that people who are fresh out of university and boot camps actually, in many cases, because they've been practicing, are better at the kind of problem that gets asked in an interview than your very senior, 8-10 years of experience at large company engineer. What the senior engineer has typically is experience making architecture decisions, owning projects, gathering requirements, carrying that whole process through. And
so, okay, how do we evaluate for that?
It's super hard. Yeah. Basically, what ends up happening, and this is honestly unfair, is that experience is used as a proxy for that. This is something that we're focusing on a lot at Trillbyte. But this is very strange. Actually, if you have 5 years of experience, it's just flat out easier to pass an interview. You will get a job offer, after a worse performance. People think maybe that senior engineers, you expect their senior, they should perform better in the interview, and that's actually not generally true. The bar to getting a job offer goes down as you have sort of a impressive-looking resume, and it's not irrational on the part of the companies. It's just the reality.
Sure. Okay. And so then, when you guys are pre-screening these people for Triplebyte, for example, what are you looking at? What are you having them do?
So the approach that we take is to evaluate as much as we can in isolation and be aware of what we're evaluating. So we explicitly evaluate programming productivity, given a relatively, a specced out problem. So for example, it's describing an algorithm to solve a problem. It's not super mathy. It's just here's the set of steps that you have to do. Can the candidate take that and, render it into well-working, well-structured code? And interestingly, junior folks actually often do better than senior folks at that sort of problem. We then separately do a evaluation of sort of academic computer science skills. Is the engineer knowledgeable about computer science and about sort of that approach to problem solving? We then separately, one thing that we took from Stripe actually is we do a debugging section. Okay. And so we give the candidate a large code base and that has some bugs, and we ask them to sort of take some time dig into the code base, and then try to find and fix these bugs. And I think this does a great job of solving some of those problems, basically, because this is a skill that comes from experience that is often missed by more traditional interviews. And then finally, we do a system design section. So here's some requirements. Design a production web system to satisfy these requirements. Okay, now we're going to change the requirements. How do you adapt your design? How do you talk about trade-offs?
And all of that's done remotely because the person's at home, right?
Yes, we do this all over Google Hangouts.
Okay, and so what's a reasonable amount of time for someone to just go through one of these exercises? Are they all widely different, or
to go through our exercises?
Mm-hmm.
Our interviews are about 2 hours in length, and so we spend about 30 minutes on each section.
Okay, cool. And you find that's a very strong data set in terms of correlating how successful they are?
Yeah. Well, we've done about 2,000 of these interviews over the last year and a half, and so we've been able to sort of drill in on the parts that are most predictive and cut time off and shorten it. I think if you're starting from scratch, you would probably need about twice the amount of time to get through all that stuff.
Okay. And so so having gone through all these interviews at this point, was there anything that you thought was really important in the beginning, or something that's very common in the Valley that many people think is important that isn't really important?
Too much reliance on a single question. So the classic interview format in tech companies is a number of 1 hour, so 45-minute to 1 hour sessions. Mm-hmm. And often engineers pick the questions themselves, and they're usually little nuggets of they're sometimes pejoratively called brain teasers. I don't think almost no one actually asks brain teasers. They're more legitimate programming problems, but they just are little nuggets of difficulty. Like, how do you given a string of parentheses, how do you determine if they're well matched? Okay, given multiple types, how do you determine if they're well matched? If you don't that's a classic interview question, and it ends up there's just a huge amount of noise. If you just take a bunch of candidates and in a controlled setting have them all answer 3 or 4 of these questions, you'll see there's some correlation, but there's way less correlation than you would think. And companies, honestly, I believe this in my previous, when I was, you have this question, you ask them the question, and you see this variation, and you assume, the people who answer this question well must be smart and good programmers, and the people who get totally tripped up must not be. And then when you actually inspect that, you see that there's this huge amount of noise, and we have this pretty incredible lens on this because we evaluate engineers pretty rigorously and then send them out to multiple companies and see what happens, get detailed feedback. And
so, is that feedback from the actual interview process, or then once they're placed, you actually know as well how they're doing?
Both.
Okay.
But I'm currently talking about the interview process.
Okay.
So we screen engineers, we send them to companies, and then they do the interview there, and we get feedback. And it's just pretty incredible how much disagreement there is. So a candidate who does really well at one company, and we get told, this is the best people person we've interviewed in months, this is a rock star, goes on to fail an interview at somewhere else. And a pretty interesting stat we dug up is I compared the rate of agreement between interviewers at companies with a data set of users reviewing movies online, right? And the numbers were basically, and the inter-rater agreement was equivalent. So basically, knowing that an engineer did well at one company gives you about as much information about whether that engineer is skilled as knowing whether the New York Times film critic rated 12 Years a Slave as excellent or terrible.
So okay. Maybe you don't have an answer to this, but say I'm really good at brain teasers. Where should I interview?
Larger companies. Okay. Probably larger companies. So, and this makes a certain amount of, this is all very complicated. It makes a certain amount of sense. So bigger companies, so brain teasers always introduce noise, but we've found that bigger companies rely more on that type of interview. And they do that partly for some rational reasons. So bigger companies care more about measuring your innate ability and less about measuring whether you can jump into their particular code base and be productive on day one. So it's way more likely that a smaller company is going to say, we're using Ruby on Rails. We need a very productive Rails developer. come take this interview, and we're going to measure how well you can, maybe how well you can work on our actual code base.
Okay.
Whereas the big companies, Facebook, Dropbox, Apple, Google, are more likely to say, we care about smart people, and within the confines of the noise of the interview process, they're trying to identify intelligence rather than specific experience.
I mean, they also have like capacity, time to train people.
Precisely.
Whereas like a small company, no way. Okay, and then like prior, one of the questions, what about skills that people don't think is correlated that are strongly correlated to a successful engineer?
Relatively easy problem solving. So we have found that asking pretty easy interview questions is often more generally predictive than asking harder interview questions. And so, let's just to break this down, there are two sources of signal from asking a question. You can get signal on whether the candidate comes up with the right answer, and you can get signal on whether they, whether they struggle, how easy or hard it is for them to solve the problem. And so we score both these things for a bunch of questions, and we've done this for, again, thousands of candidates. And what we found is that if you go in and look at how much, the individual score on one question we're asking correlates with how the candidate does on the job. And what we've found is that, as you would expect, getting a question right is correlated with being an engineer. And as you would expect, being able to answer a question easily is correlated with being a good engineer. But there's also, of course, false negatives, right? So there are great engineers who fail individual questions, and there are great engineers who struggle with questions. And if you look at the actual predictive ability, rather than just the correlation of getting on the right side, right? The sweet spot is actually far lower on the scale than most people intuitively think.
And so, can you give like a couple examples of what those easier questions might be?
Yeah, sure. Just to saying we want you to create a checkers game. Absolutely no logic, nothing complicated, just a class that has a board, has a grid, it's got pieces move around. This is really a pretty mundane, straightforward task. That actually ends up being, how well candidates do that ends up being a more stable predictor of engineering skill than sort of, here's I'm going to give you a sentence that consists of a list of words all glammed together, and you define the optimal way to, given a dictionary, to break this apart into words.
Okay.
That second problem, ends up being a graph search problem that can be, optimized with, memorization or dynamic programming. Getting the second problem right carries more information than getting the first problem right, but with a really high false negative rate.
Yeah.
And so the first problem ends up actually being a better general predictor of engineering skill.
And so is there a way, if I'm like getting ready for a new, I'm going to go to another company, I'm going to get ready to interview. Do you recommend people train in any particular way? Or is because like you're going for that sweet spot of easy questions, like you just have to be smart enough to do it? Like, what do you tell people?
Sort of in general? Across the board?
If I'm going to prep to do some interviews, what would I do?
So, I guess there's two questions there. One is what I think, for companies that I think are doing a good job of interviewing, and then maybe for what I think some of the status quo is. In general, it depends where you're coming from. So very different advice for new grads and for experienced folks.
Okay, so let's break them apart. Yeah, new grads.
Yeah. Okay, for new grads, I would say make sure you're solid with sort of the classic sort of stuff that breadth first search, hash tables, heaps.
It's important.
Classic core computer science. Yeah. A surprising percentage of a new question ends up being slightly obscured applications of sort of those, especially sort of hash tables and breadth first search. Those two things by themselves represent probably 40% of the questions that are asked by most companies. And so you need to know those. But actually, many new grads are already pretty solid on that because they've been being drilled that throughout school. The second thing is practicing writing code under stress. So working out a big problem over time is very different than you have 10 minutes or 30 minutes. Here's a marker right in a whiteboard, or even here's a laptop program on it. And so just the things correlate, the skills correlate, but you can improve your performance by practicing. So totally put in 30 minutes a day finding some questions online and giving yourself a time limit and sort of trying to solve them under stressful situations.
And are there good resources that people can look for? Like anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean the classic ones, right? So Cracking the Coding Interview has a pretty good list of questions. It's the other advice in that book I don't think really applies to startups very much, but the questions are good. Then there are a bunch of sites online that have lists. Interview Cake is one that I've seen that I think is high quality. An interesting aside to this though is that most companies actually want you to do these things, right? It's not companies would prefer that all their candidates, we totally prefer. Now we try to design our interview in such a way that there's no impact, right? We don't really want to be measuring if you've been cramming on algorithms. But what interview companies want to measure is like max skill, max potential. So they would actually much rather see you, in a state where you're well prepared in the material, right? Rather than a state when you've have the potential to understand it, but forgot about it.
Yeah.
An interesting trend that's happening in the industry is companies being more upfront about what they're asking. So Facebook, for example, has started providing a sort of an interview prep class to everyone who applies, so that they're sort of going over the material. It's part of me finds it encouraging because it is moving in a better direction, but then it's also discouraging because it's like really sucky that you have to take a class to figure out how to.
Right. I just wonder if it's filtering for those types of people, right? Who are just looking for I don't know what to do. It's like, well, if you apply here, you can take the class and then let me hold your hand the whole way through your life.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So say I am going to interview at a bigger company. Is there a way to prep to do well with the brain teaser stuff?
Yeah, practice. So again, there are some words that are thrown around describing interview questions that aren't. Brain teasers are pretty rare. Some companies probably have asked things like, the golf balls in a 747, but that's really very rare. Much more common is application of a computer science idea to a practical problem.
Okay.
And there still is this leap of insight required. In many cases, I think those are bad interview questions, right? You don't companies should try very hard to ask questions where it's not like there's one thing that has to be grasped until that's grasped, the problem feels impossible. But hard application, sort of practical application of a computer science topic represents the significant majority of questions at big companies.
And so when I was in college, I interviewed at one of those big management consulting firms, and they did have all those questions. And so we spent 2 months prepping for it, and I didn't get the job. And I did okay on the stupid ping pong ball questions.
Well, you don't have to feel bad. One number we have that's interesting is that the engineers who do the best at companies go on to pass about 80% of their interviews, but not 100. Almost no one passes more than 80% of their interviews at companies.
Okay.
So one big bit of advice to everyone is just don't feel bad if you fail the interview. It is really not a referendum on your skill.
I'm very happy to have not gone in that direction. So what about the role of projects? Someone's portfolio of side projects. Are there certain types of side projects that across the board are attractive to companies, or is it say I'm applying for a job at Stripe and I did X payment type project and that would be more attractive to them. So across the board, are there things that are interesting?
Let me answer that question, and then we'll talk about what I think the right thing for companies to do is. So companies don't actually pay very much attention to side projects.
Okay.
Except for at the screening stage. So resume screen, candidate applies to company,
mm-hmm.
the company decides if they're going to interview the person at all.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some adverse selection bias in who applies to companies, and there's this big stream of candidates. And so at any company, there's this huge stream coming in, and they have to decide somehow. And so they do that based on resume screens, and it comes down to pretty dumb credential stuff, right? If you've worked at a top company, if you've gone to a top school, or in some cases, if you have a project that catches the eye, that's impressive.
Mm.
And so side projects can help a lot there.
Okay.
But they are very rarely given away in the actual interview. And I think it's actually probably the right decision. So people who have side projects sometimes feel bad about this. But the reason it's the right decision is that most engineers don't have side projects. Most engineers have been working at a company, and it's all proprietary code, and there's very little they can show. That's 8 out of 10 engineers are in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And having a consistent process, consistent, fair, like consistency is the first goal of designing an interview process, so that the big problem is that the process is not usually consistent. So if you make it consistent, then you can optimize it. And having this sort of other process where you look at projects introduces noise, and it's also just really hard to do. So you can't tell if someone spent, a weekend on the project, or if they've been working on it for like the last 10 years. We literally see both pretty regularly when we talk to people about their projects. It's something I did over a weekend, or this has been my, abiding passion for the last 10 years.
Let alone like who actually contributed.
Yeah, and things like coding quality, right? It's startlingly hard to look at a big bit of code and decide if you think the programmer who wrote it is skilled. Just again, like there's so much context, you can't tell what bugs they spend hours over. Finding bugs. Like none of us are good enough to look at a code and like immediately find the bugs. And so for that reason, for all those reasons, side projects are useful. So if your problem as an engineer, it's just advice to engineers, if you're applying for jobs and you're being screened out a lot at the resume stage, doing projects probably helps. Doing projects is a great way to obviously increase your skills, and that will be reflected in better performance on interviews. But I don't think projects have a very big role in the actual interview.
And so what other things should I think about if I am being screened out? Like, say, I'm getting a call back from like a 1 out of 10.
Yep.
What should I do?
Apply to TripleByte? That's the short answer. Otherwise, yeah, side projects help. It just sucks, right? It's this.
Totally.
It's not malice on the part of the companies. They're overwhelmed by applicants, and so they use these sort of crude filters. And that's I think the big thing that we're focused on is trying to figure out how to directly measure the skill, and so that we don't have to rely on filters like where someone's worked or what school they went to.
And what about things like, for example, location? So say I live in Salt Lake City and I'm interested in getting a job possibly at Facebook. Should I put like San Francisco on my resume and just like fly out for an interview? Do you have general advice in that area?
Big companies don't care at all where you're based. They fly people in, by the hundreds every week.
Okay.
Smaller companies do show a slight preference to local candidates, and so if your goal is to work at a small, let's say sub 20-person startup, you're probably at a 10 to 20% advantage if you're based in the Bay Area.
Right there. Okay, cool. So from the company side, there's like a million different interview methods that people go for. Say we are, they go through TripleByte, they get screened, they're going to do an interview. Whiteboarding, pair programming, all that stuff. How do you feel about it?
All the methods can work. There are here. Let me sort of give a bit of an overview here. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the core problem is there's this tension between the skills that can be measured in an interview, solving small problems quickly, and the skill that matters as a programmer, solving big projects over a long period of time. And so the first approach you can take to interviewing is to say, okay, we're gonna not do it. We're gonna do like trial employment, so something like that. And that totally works. If you've worked with someone for a week, you have a far better read of their skill than I think anyone can get during a 3 to 4 hour interview. The problem is that there's a pretty strong bias in who's willing to do trial employment. And it's adverse bias. So many of the best programmers have lots of options. And if your company requires that everyone do this trial employment period, most of them are not going to just going to say no. And obviously anyone who currently has a job,
they can't leave for a week.
Can't leave for a week. Yeah. And of course, there's also, you're committing a week of time. And so obviously you need some filter before the trial, employment. And so I think in the end, we're left with a thing kind of like the famous, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. I think that, interviews are the worst way to evaluate engineers except for like all the other options. And so you have to do it. It's fundamentally inaccurate, but you still have to do it. And the goal is to make it as accurate as possible. And so once you're on that page, we see two sources of noise. We see noise that comes from the companies being inconsistent. So I talked about that a bit earlier. It is still too often the process that engineers are responsible for coming with their own questions. So if you're asking every candidate different questions and coming to a gut call, there's just this far larger than anyone really realize is source of noise. And so, like, if you asked, pick any company that has that process, if you ask them to somehow re-interview their colleagues, in a blind fashion, right? They would have they would likely have a 50 to 60% pass rate, right? So 40% of their colleagues would be screened out. And so the solution there is just to be really consistent.
Okay.
So like make sure that you're asking everyone the same question and make sure that you're evaluating them in the same way. And I think that's more important than what you're actually asking, right? So like the first step is be consistent. Second step is tweak that over time based on the results you see.
Okay.
Once you're doing that, I think the other source of noise we see is companies looking for different things. Right, and so as an example, like if earlier you have a company that's looking for super academic, engineers. Yeah. You have companies looking for very practical engineers. You have companies that think that all skilled engineers know about how operating systems work. You have companies who think that they only want to talk to people who have experience in compiled languages. You have companies who hate compiled languages and think they're old and stodgy. You have companies who want people to use enterprise languages. You have companies. It's this mess.
Yeah.
And so I think the important thing is to untangle which of those are conscious decisions you're making about who you want to hire. Mm-hmm. So you're a banking company, you want a big focus on, QA process and safe code. It probably makes sense to reject someone for being too much of a cowboy. You're a social media company, your goal is to move really fast. Maybe you decide to have a culture where you want to move fast and break things and you want to hire cowboys. Those are logical decisions.
Okay.
But very often companies are making similar kinds of decisions almost by accident. And so sort of introspection, deciding, okay, like there's always we want to hire those people, and then designing the process to look for it. Okay. And so in your examples, whiteboard coding tends to skew toward the academic. It tends to give preference to people who are really good at breaking their thoughts down into this sort of structured academic way and writing with a small amount of code. So you often have people who are actually really productive, excellent programmers who look really stupid and bad on a whiteboard interview. And so if you're not looking for academic skills, it probably makes more sense to put people on an actual computer and see how they actually work in their environment.
Okay. And so what does the underlying question for me is could you engineer a perfect interview? But I wonder what does the interview for a job at TripleByte look like? I imagine you made it, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, so first of all, everyone goes through all our candidates go through our regular process.
Okay.
So we hire people out of our regular stream, and then we compete head to head with the companies. So we just enter them to us as well as other companies, and which is kind of fun. Yeah. So they first go through a regular process, and so we already have a pretty strong sense of how they are in those areas. And then just my advice generally is to decide what the skills that you preference. And so I think we preference a couple of things. We preference, data and data analysis is pretty key to our business. And so we preference people being comfortable and familiar, talking and thinking about data. That skews a bit more academic, I think, than what many companies hire for. And then because we're in the business of evaluating knowledge really broadly, we then preference breadth of knowledge, I think to a greater degree than most companies need to. And
so what does that mean in practice? What questions would I be looking at?
Yeah. So everyone goes through first our standard process.
Yeah.
And so that gives us a pretty good read on just, productive programming output, general knowledge of computer science, general knowledge of system design, and then we do an additional follow-up, on site with the candidates, and that goes much more into depth into data. Or if we're hiring them for a different role, we sometimes hire folks who are not working in your data. So if we're hiring to be sort of say a front-end developer, that would be sort of into depth into front-end development. And so here's a spec for a front-end project. You have 2 hours, build that. Or if they're going to be a backend specialist, here's a backend spec.
Got you. Okay. And so as an engineer, should I be paying attention to every new thing that's coming out? Is that going to be of importance when I'm doing an interview, or should I be paying attention to a medium amount of it?
Well, there's an interesting longer term answer. So one thing, a class of people we see, interestingly, we see people who thought about that same thing 10 years ago.
Right.
Made the decision to not keep up. Now the industry has changed, and now these folks, are maybe still using, let's say, CGI, and don't understand modern web stack, and are indeed in a weak situation in interviews. So I think the answer to your question is, day one is not so important. Very few companies, especially generally only smaller ones, are directly evaluating flashy new tech. However, if you make the decision too forcefully today, and don't keep up to date, and you end up being totally behind 10 years from now, then you probably are gonna pay a price.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're actually interested in starting your own thing at some point, like being on the edge really, really matters. Okay, I mean, maybe this is kind of difficult to answer, but I wonder about like employee retention, engineer retention. Are there any qualities that you've found like you can vet someone and say like, okay, I think the average is like 18 months or something for someone to stay around? Are there qualities that correlate to longer term employment?
I haven't looked at our data on this recently, so this is going to be a little bit sort of off the cuff.
Yeah.
I mean, just the obvious things. If candidates who are excited about the mission in the actual company have a higher probability of staying than candidates who are chasing the highest paycheck. Of course, there are counterexamples. Sometimes there are awesome engineers who are looking for a place to really commit, but also want to make a fair wage. So it's all like these things are all really complicated. But yeah, looking for. I think the number one thing I would just say is looking for engineers who are excited about the company and the job. Okay,
cool. So kind of just wrapping up, I wonder, are there any books or things that if I'm kind of like an engineering manager, I'm going to be running a bunch of interviews that I should really dig into and I can get a lot out of?
I have not actually found any books that I think are very useful. I think this is going to sound arrogant maybe, but I think interviewing is this field where it's so easy to say things that sound profound that are not true.
Okay.
I truly believe that like 80% of what's written out there about interviewing just doesn't actually hold up. So for example, it sounds like a really idea that a lot of engineers love, right? Is the statement that interviews don't make any sense at all, and you should just look at work someone has done in the past. And we tested this a bunch. We tried scoring engineers and having them talk about past projects and scoring them and trying even like a full hour, like going into depth in the project, talking technical details, scoring it. Just talking skill, ability to spin a tale ended up dominating the actual engineering rigor. And this was far less predictive of job performance than giving them a relatively simple programming assignment. I mean, and that kind of sucks. Like, I don't really like that's the case. And you can find so many articles out there about sort of this. It's stupid that we're asking engineers to do these interviews. Why don't we just have them talk about their past experience? And just if you test it, it doesn't hold up.
And just for the sake of like keeping things standard, right? What do you tell people to do in that way when they're conducting an interview?
Well, I mean, standardize, right? So, well, you'd be really careful about helping people, interestingly. So certain candidates are a lot better at eliciting help without you necessarily realizing that you're helping them. It's something we've had to battle with a bunch, actually. And so it helps because we're doing thousands of interviews, and so it's easier for us to do this. But sort of we have kind of a decision tree of all the different ways an interview can go and like what help we're allowed to give and what help we're not allowed to give. It's a big source of noise. Outside of doing 1,000 interviews and standardizing it, I'm not sure I have a really good fix for it. But be aware that some really compassionate candidates will be like.
Okay, well, so what's a common area where I might ask for help without you even realizing that I'm getting help?
One is just being brave enough to ask. So saying like being really friendly.
Yeah.
And then saying something with confidence that's sort of right. And then there's this natural instinct to like add on to it and correct the error. And as the interviewer, it's really easy to do that and not realize that you're like steering the person through the problem.
So if you're going out for interviews, you should do exactly that.
I have a blog post on how to prepare for interviews, and I recommend trying to do that, actually.
Really? Oh, that's awesome.
I want to add a sort of a side to that, though, which is like actually the negative side of that, which is that interviewing can turn into hazing. Another interviewing is not just evaluation; it's also like this shared right of entry into a company, and some companies develop this culture around the interviews being hard and unpleasant. And as the interviewer, it's really easy to forget how much harder it is if you're the one answering the question. It's so much easier to feel smart when you're asking the question. And sometimes candidates get really flustered and like can't answer a question, and it seems like it's really frustrating as the interviewer if they're like, this thing is obvious in front of them and they're just missing it and they're wasting your time, and you can get a little bit angry inside. And it's just really important to stay away from like the hazing, the like taking out anger on them by I'm generally, against cutting interviews short. Actually, I think except for in the case where the candidate is in pain, I think it's not worth doing. I think you save some time, but you damage reputation. You know, they really dislike it. It's embarrassing.
Okay.
But definitely staying away from the hazing, staying away from like the.
So does that just mean like crazy brain teasers? Does that mean like cutting them off in conversation? What does that mean?
Yeah, it means all those things, right? So it means crazy brain teasers. Being mean, thinking, sort of getting slightly angry and aggressive in how you answer their questions, because you're frustrated by how poorly they're doing.
Okay.
And a trick that we use that I think helps in that case is to sort of, in the case where a candidate is totally failing the interview, like flipping a switch in your brain and going from like evaluation mode into teaching mode. And your like full goal now is just to explain and as friendly as possible. Like, I mean, generally, you already know the person failed, right? So this happens when the person has already essentially failed, at least the problem, if not the interview.
Sure.
And so you already have in their brain found that, okay, this person is not passing.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to spend the remaining 15 minutes being friendly and explaining the answer to this question.
Sure.
Rather than continuing to try to elicit responses from them.
And what about the just the dynamic? Like, do you advise one-on-one interviews, or how many people per interviewee?
Yeah, interview panel definitely increases the stress.
Yeah.
So we max out at 2 to 1. So it's training is important, right? So if you're trying to keep it consistent, you need to have continual cross. People need to watch each other's interviews, and so but two, sort of one interviewer, one shadower is enough to do that. Going beyond that increases the stress, and I don't think it really helps.
Cool. So if people want to follow up with you and ask you questions, how can they reach out to you?
Sure. My email is Ammon@drillbyte.com. That's AMMON.
Cool. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Craig.